My husband became top salesperson at his father's company. At dinner he laughed, saying I should take notes from a real professional. He joked my biggest achievement was folding laundry on time. He told everyone I married him for money. They all laughed. He said, "Relax, it's a joke." I smiled. Jokes are fun. I own 56% of his company. You're fired. Her biggest achievement is probably folding laundry on time. Julian's words hung in the air at the Silverstone grill for just a moment before the entire table erupted in laughter. I sat frozen in my chair, watching my husband's face glow with satisfaction as his joke landed exactly the way he had planned. Richard slapped the table so hard the wine glasses rattled. Chelsea from Human Resources covered her mouth, but her shoulders shook with laughter. Marcus from Operations had actual tears streaming down his face. Even the couple at the neighboring table was smiling, drawn into the entertainment of watching a successful man publicly mock his wife. Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here and sharing these stories of strength and resilience. If you believe that competence deserves recognition regardless of who sees it, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more people who need to hear this. Now let's see what happens next. Julian was standing at the head of our table with a wine glass raised, delivering what he clearly thought was a charming and affectionate speech about his journey to becoming top salesperson at Pemberton Technologies. He had just finished thanking his father Richard for giving him opportunities to prove himself. He had thanked his colleagues for their support and collaboration. And now he was thanking me, his wife, by telling everyone assembled that my greatest accomplishment in life was successfully folding his laundry without shrinking his expensive shirts. No, seriously, Julian continued, warming to his theme as the laughter began to die down. Violet has mastered all the traditional domestic skills. The house is always organized. My schedule is always managed. My dry cleaning is always picked up on time. She really knows her place. More laughter. I felt my face burning, but I kept my expression neutral. I had learned over 18 months of marriage that reacting to Julian's jokes only made them worse, gave him permission to dismiss my feelings as oversensitivity or inability to take a light-hearted comment. And let's be completely honest here, Julian added, his voice taking on a conspiratorial tone as he leaned slightly toward Richard. She married me for the money. I mean, can we just acknowledge that? Smart move on her part, really. Can't blame a woman for recognizing a good opportunity. The laughter this time was even louder. Richard was practically choking. Connor from sales was bent over his plate in what looked like genuine physical pain from laughing so hard. I watched their faces, cataloged their reactions, and thought about the envelope in my handbag. Inside that envelope were legal documents proving that I owned 56% of Pemberton Technologies. I was the majority shareholder of the company where Julian worked, where Richard served as CEO, where every person at this table drew their paycheck. I had saved the company from bankruptcy 18 months ago when Richard's catastrophically bad investments had pushed it to the edge of collapse. I had negotiated controlling interest through my attorney while Richard was too desperate and too arrogant to understand what he was actually signing away. And Julian had no idea about any of it because Julian had never once asked what I did with my time or where I had come from professionally before we married. To him, I was simply Violet, the wife who kept his life organized and knew her place was at home supporting his career. Julian reached over and patted my hand in that condescending way he had developed. The gesture that was supposed to look affectionate but felt like he was comforting a child who had misunderstood adult conversation. Don't be mad, honey. You know I'm just teasing. But seriously, maybe you should take notes tonight from a real professional. Watch how actual achievement works. Might learn something. The table waited for my response. I could see it in their faces. They expected me to laugh along, to make some self-deprecating comment about being lucky to have married so well, to play my assigned role in Julian's performance of superiority. That I smiled. You're right, I said calmly. Jokes are fun. Want to hear mine? The way we had arrived at this moment had taken 18 months of careful planning, though planning was probably too intentional a word for what had actually happened. It was more like 18 months of watching and waiting while Julian and his father Richard slowly revealed exactly who they were beneath the surface charm and professional competence they projected to the world. I had married Julian Pemberton 2 years earlier in a wedding that his father had orchestrated with the precision of a corporate merger. Everything had been perfect in that calculated way that suggested money and control rather than genuine celebration. The venue had been a historic estate with manicured gardens. The guest list had included 300 people, most of whom I had never met but who apparently mattered to Richard's business interests. The whole event had cost more than most people earned in several years, and Julian had seemed genuinely pleased with how impressive everything looked in the photographs that would later appear in the society pages of local magazines. Back then, I had been finishing the sale of my data analytics company, a business I had co-founded 5 years earlier with a college friend who understood technology infrastructure better than anyone I had ever met. We had built something quietly successful, the kind of company that solved real problems for corporate clients without attracting media attention or venture capital drama. When a larger firm approached us about acquisition, we negotiated terms that allowed both of us to walk away with enough money to retire comfortably if we chose, though neither of us had any intention of actually retiring at 32. I had told Julian about the sale, though perhaps I had not explained the magnitude of it in ways he would have understood as significant. He had smiled and said something about how nice it was that my little project had worked out, then immediately changed the subject to his own career trajectory at Pemberton Technologies. That should have been my first warning about how he viewed my professional accomplishments, but I was still in the early stages of marriage where you tell yourself that small dismissals are just miscommunication rather than patterns that will define your entire relationship. The shift from cautious optimism to clear-eyed recognition had happened gradually over the first year of our marriage. Julian would come home from work and spend hours recounting his day in elaborate detail, never once asking about mine. At company events, he would introduce me as his wife Violet without mentioning anything about my background or career. When his colleagues made polite conversation, their questions were always variations on the same theme. How was I enjoying being married? What did I think of the house we had purchased? Was I planning to start a family soon? No one ever asked what I did professionally because Julian's introductions had already established that my primary identity was as his spouse. I had started making myself smaller in those situations, taking up less space in conversations, projecting less presence. It was not a conscious decision at first. It was more like an instinctive response to an environment that clearly did not want me to be fully present. Julian seemed more comfortable when I played the role of the quiet, supportive wife. His father Richard appeared to approve of me more when I asked questions that allowed him to explain things rather than demonstrating that I already understood the concepts he was describing. The whole social ecosystem of Pemberton Technologies seemed designed to reward women who made themselves decorative rather than substantial. What I had not realized until much later was that the invisibility I was cultivating could be used strategically. While I was standing at the periphery of company parties holding Julian's drink and nodding at appropriate moments, I was also observing the actual power dynamics of the organization. I was learning who made real decisions versus who just held impressive titles. I was noticing which executives were genuinely competent and which ones had advanced through relationships and politics rather than ability. I was building a mental map of Pemberton Technologies that would later prove invaluable when Richard came to me desperate and terrified. That conversation had happened on a Tuesday evening in late 2022 at one of Richard's monthly family dinners. These gatherings were mandatory performances where Richard held court and everyone pretended his stories about the early days of building Pemberton Technologies were fascinating rather than repetitive. I had been in the kitchen helping his housekeeper arrange dessert plates when Richard appeared in the doorway looking like a man who had just received devastating news. His usual confident posture was gone. His face had a grayish quality that suggested either serious illness or serious crisis. He had asked if we could speak privately, his voice carrying an urgency I had never heard from him before. We went to his home office where he poured himself whiskey with hands that shook visibly. Then he told me the company was facing what he called temporary liquidity challenges, though everything about his delivery suggested there was nothing temporary about the situation. Richard explained that he had made investment decisions over the past 18 months that had not performed as expected. Actually, the investments had failed catastrophically. He had poured millions of dollars of company capital into trendy ventures that promised revolutionary returns but delivered nothing except losses. Metaverse real estate that turned out to be worthless digital nothing. NFT authentication systems that solved problems nobody actually had. A cryptocurrency backed by theoretical carbon credits that existed only in ambitious white papers written by people who understood neither technology nor environmental policy. The company was drowning in $17 million of debt. Creditors were threatening legal action. Pemberton Technologies was weeks away from a crisis that would destroy everything Richard had built and expose him as the kind of leader who gambled recklessly with company assets and lost spectacularly. He needed someone who could inject significant capital without alerting the board or creating panic among employees and clients. He needed family who could be trusted to stay quiet about the real situation. He needed me. I remember sitting in that leather chair across from Richard's desk, watching him sweat through his explanation, and feeling something shift inside me. This man who had spent 18 months treating me as decorative furniture, who had never asked about my career or acknowledged my professional capabilities, was now admitting that I might be his only hope for salvation. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. I had not answered immediately. I wanted him to sit in the discomfort of needing me, of having to ask for help from someone he had dismissed as merely his son's wife. When I finally spoke, I told him I would consider his proposal but that I would need complete financial transparency and the involvement of my attorney before making any decisions. The next morning I called Lauren Hastings, the corporate attorney who had handled the sale of my company. Lauren had a reputation for ruthless precision and zero tolerance for emotional decision-making in business contexts. When I explained Richard's situation, she was quiet for a long moment before asking a single question that changed everything. "Do you want to be a passive investor?" Lauren asked. "Or do you want control?" I had not thought about it in those terms before, but the moment she asked, I knew the answer. I wanted control. Not because I was interested in running Pemberton Technologies day to day, but because I understood that power without visibility was the most effective kind of power. Lauren spent 3 weeks constructing an acquisition structure so elegant and complex that it belonged in a textbook on corporate strategy. She created holding companies nested within trusts, institutional intermediaries that held shares on behalf of entities that appeared to be standard investment firms. The structure was designed so that tracing my actual ownership would require forensic accounting that Richard would never think to conduct and probably could not afford even if he did. On paper I was nowhere. In reality, I controlled 56% of Pemberton Technologies with full authority over major corporate decisions, board appointments and executive terminations. Richard knew I was the majority shareholder because he had to know in order to sign the agreements, but we structured everything so he could continue as CEO and maintain his public position as long as the company remained profitable and stable. He had been pathetically grateful, almost tearful with relief that I was willing to save his legacy. He never once asked why I was being so generous or what I might want in exchange beyond the equity stake we had negotiated. He simply assumed I was behaving the way family was supposed to behave, providing help without demanding recognition or control. Julian knew nothing about any of it. Richard and I had agreed that telling Julian about the ownership structure would create unnecessary complications. Richard framed it as protecting Julian from worry during a stressful period for the company. I suspected the real reason was that Richard was ashamed of needing rescue and did not want his son to know how badly he had mismanaged the company's assets. So I had spent the past 18 months being even more invisible than before. When Julian came home talking about the company's remarkable turnaround and his father's brilliant leadership, I nodded and asked interested questions while never mentioning that the turnaround existed only because of capital I had provided. When Richard called seeking approval for various decisions as required by our shareholder agreement, I would meet him at quiet restaurants where no one would recognize us or question why we were talking. I attended company events as Julian's wife, standing at the periphery while executives discussed quarterly performance I could have recited from memory because I reviewed every financial report in detail. The invisibility was strategic now rather than defensive. I knew that Julian's ego and Richard's pride would eventually create a moment where their treatment of me became so publicly dismissive that I would be entirely justified in whatever response I chose. I had been waiting for this moment. Patient because patience is power that most people never learn to wield effectively. Watching Julian's career advance on a foundation I had built while he credited his own talent. Listening to Richard take credit for the company's stabilization while never acknowledging where the rescue capital had originated. And now here we were at the Silverstone Grill with Julian standing at our table making jokes about laundry and money while everyone laughed at my expense. This was exactly what I had been waiting for. The perfect public humiliation that would justify the response I was about to deliver. I reached into my handbag and pulled out the envelope, feeling its weight in my hands. Inside were the legal documents that would end Julian's career in the next 60 seconds. I slid the envelope across the table toward him and watched confusion flicker across his face. Julian stared at the envelope like it might contain a bomb. His confident smile had frozen on his face, creating an expression that looked more like a grimace. The laughter around the table was dying down, replaced by curious silence as everyone noticed the shift in atmosphere. "What's this?" he asked, trying to maintain his casual tone even as his hand reached for the envelope with visible reluctance. "Open it," I said simply. He did. I watched his fingers fumble with the flap, pulling out the documents that Lauren had prepared with her characteristic thoroughness. The first page showed the corporate ownership structure of Pemberton Technologies in clean legal language that left no room for misinterpretation. I watched his eyes scan the text, saw the exact moment comprehension hit. His face drained of color so completely I thought he might actually faint. "I own 56% of Pemberton Technologies," I said conversationally, pitching my voice to carry across the table. "Which means I own this company. Your company. Your father's company. And effective immediately, Julian Pemberton, you're fired." The silence that followed was extraordinary. Every face at the table had frozen mid-expression. Richard's hand was suspended in the air where he had been reaching for his wine glass. Chelsea's mouth hung open in an O of shock. Marcus looked like someone had just explained that gravity no longer functioned according to known physics. Connor had stopped laughing so abruptly it looked painful. But it was Julian's face that held my attention. I watched 18 months of casual dismissal collapse in real time. I watched him realize that every promotion he had received, every deal he had closed, every moment of professional pride had been built on a foundation I had provided while he mocked my supposed incompetence. I watched him understand that the wife he had treated as decorative furniture held absolute power over the career he had assumed was secured by his own merit and his father's influence. "You," he started, but no other words came out. His brain seemed unable to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about his life. Richard recovered first, which made sense because at least he knew I had provided rescue capital even if he had not fully comprehended the terms. He lunged across the table and snatched the documents from Julian's nerveless fingers, scanning through pages with growing horror. I could see him recognizing Lauren's signature, her law firm's letterhead, understanding that this was not some kind of elaborate joke but completely legitimate legal documentation. "This is impossible," Richard said, his voice hollow. "Violet, this can't be. We had an agreement. You were supposed to be a passive investor. You said you weren't interested in operational control." "I said I wasn't interested in day-to-day management," I corrected gently. "I never said anything about giving up decision-making authority. You were desperate enough to sign the agreements Lauren prepared without reading them carefully. That's not my problem." Julian found his voice, though it cracked with emotion. "But you told me you were doing consulting work. You said you had advisory projects. You never mentioned owning a company, let alone this company." "You never asked," I replied. "You were too busy telling me about your achievements to inquire about mine. Too focused on your success to wonder where the capital came from that saved your father's business when it was drowning in debt from catastrophically terrible investment decisions." I turned to Richard. "Metaverse real estate, wasn't it? And NFT authentication systems? And that cryptocurrency backed by theoretical carbon credits that never actually existed? $17 million of company money gambled on trends you didn't understand because you were too arrogant to admit you had no idea what you were investing in." Richard's face had gone from gray to red, a dangerous color that suggested his blood pressure was reaching levels that probably required medical attention. "Violet, you can't fire my son over a joke. This is absurd." This has nothing to do with tonight's joke," I interrupted, though that was not entirely honest. "This is about the fact that nepotism and mediocrity are poor foundations for sustainable business growth. Julian holds his position because he's your son, not because he's the best person for the role. That's going to change." Chelsea finally found her voice. "This is insane. You can't just walk into a celebration dinner and fire people. There are processes, protocols." "I'm the majority shareholder," I said calmly. "I can terminate employment at any level including executive leadership. Julian's position is eliminated effective immediately. Someone from Human Resources will contact him Monday morning regarding severance and benefits transition." I stood up, smoothed my dress and looked at the assembled group. These people who had spent 18 months treating me as invisible were now staring at me like I had just revealed myself as an alien species they had failed to recognize. "Thank you for dinner, everyone," I said. "The steak really was excellent. Truly exceptional quality." I picked up my handbag and walked toward the restaurant exit. Behind me, I could hear the table erupting into chaos. Julian was saying something in a voice that sounded close to panic. Richard was shouting about emergency board meetings. Chelsea was asking if someone should call the company's legal department. Marcus had started laughing again, though this time it sounded more like hysteria than amusement. The maitre d' appeared with my coat as if he had been waiting for exactly this moment. I thanked him and handed him $100 bill because none of what had just happened was his fault, and he had maintained professional composure throughout what was probably the most dramatic dinner service of his career. The cool evening air hit my face as I stepped outside. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the temperature difference shock my system slightly, grounding myself in the physical reality of what I had just done. Through the restaurant windows I could see our table, everyone standing now, gesturing frantically. Julian had his phone out, probably calling someone for advice. Richard was still holding the legal documents, flipping through pages as if hoping the text might change if he read it again. My own phone started buzzing before I even reached my car. Julian calling. I declined. Richard calling. Declined. An unknown number that was probably Chelsea trying to mediate or gather information. Declined. I drove home through quiet streets, the townhouse we had purchased together less than a year ago, though it would soon be exclusively mine once divorce proceedings were finalized. I had already consulted with Lauren about that aspect of the situation. The prenuptial agreement Julian had insisted on before our wedding, the one designed to protect his family's wealth from me, was still in effect and actually worked in my favor now because it established clean separation of assets. By the time I pulled into the garage, I had 37 missed calls. My voicemail was full. I listened to the first message from Julian while I made tea in the kitchen, his voice oscillating between rage and something that sounded almost like pleading. "You've destroyed everything," he said, thick with emotion. "My career, my reputation, my relationship with my father. How could you do this? What kind of wife destroys her husband's life over a joke? This is insane. You need to call me back right now so we can fix this before it gets worse." I deleted the message before he could finish. There was nothing to fix. This was not a misunderstanding or an overreaction. This was the inevitable consequence of 18 months of systematic dismissal and casual cruelty that Julian had assumed would never carry a price. I sat in the living room with my tea, the townhouse quiet around me. This space that had felt like a prison for the past year suddenly felt different. Lighter somehow. Like I had finally stopped carrying weight that had never been mine to bear in the first place. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Lauren calling. I answered. "I assume you've seen the news," she said without preamble. "What news?" "Someone at the restaurant posted about what happened on social media. It's spreading rapidly. Business blogs are already picking up the story. You're trending on LinkedIn." I closed my eyes. Of course someone had posted about it. This was exactly the kind of dramatic corporate confrontation that people loved sharing, turning real lives into entertainment for strangers who would debate the ethics and argue about who was right and who was wrong. "How bad is it?" I asked. Mixed reactions. Some people are calling you a genius who played the longest strategic game in business history. Others are suggesting you're vindictive and destroyed your husband's career over hurt feelings. The usual internet discourse where everyone has strong opinions about situations they don't fully understand. What about the company? Are clients panicking? Not yet. Most people don't understand the full ownership structure. They just know there was some kind of dramatic revelation at a dinner. I've already prepared a statement for the board explaining that there will be a leadership transition but that all client relationships and operational commitments remain intact. We should probably schedule a call for first thing Monday morning to discuss next steps. Agreed, I said. And Lauren, thank you for everything. This is what you pay me for, she replied. Though I have to admit, this is definitely the most dramatic ownership reveal I've ever been involved with. The legal structure held up perfectly, by the way. Richard's attorneys have already been calling, asking if there's any way to challenge the agreements. There isn't. Everything was completely above board and thoroughly documented. After we hung up, I sat alone in the quiet townhouse and thought about the path that had led here. The silence felt different now, no longer oppressive but almost peaceful. I could hear the clock ticking in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, small domestic sounds that had been drowned out by Julian's constant presence and his need to fill every space with talk about his achievements. My phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. The truth was, this moment at the Silverstone Grill had not been spontaneous. It had been building for weeks, ever since Julian received the news about his promotion to top salesperson. That announcement had come on a Wednesday afternoon in late September when he had burst through our front door with more energy than I had seen from him in months. He had been practically vibrating as he told me about beating out colleagues who had been with Pemberton Technologies far longer than he had. "This calls for a celebration," he had announced, not asked. "I'm thinking the Silverstone Grill. Saturday night. I've already texted Dad and the team." He had shown me his phone displaying a group message to Richard, Chelsea, Marcus, and Connor, complete with champagne bottle emojis and exclamation points. The message radiated self-congratulation, informing everyone that they were expected to attend his victory dinner. No questions about their availability. Just an announcement that this was happening and they needed to be there. I had read through the message and felt something crystallize inside me. This was going to be the moment. I did not know exactly how it would unfold, but I recognized that Julian's need for public validation was about to create the perfect opportunity for me to act. The days between that Wednesday announcement and Saturday evening had been remarkably instructive. Julian had spent hours preparing what he kept calling his victory speech. I would find him in our bathroom standing in front of the mirror, practicing expressions and gestures. He was rehearsing casual humility, the kind that draws attention to itself by pretending not to seek attention. Every smile was calculated. Every self-deprecating comment was designed to invite contradiction and praise. On Thursday evening, he had handed me a literal written list of conversation topics that he considered appropriate for me to discuss at the dinner. "Just stick to these," he had said, as if he were a manager briefing an unprepared employee. "Ask about their families. Compliment Chelsea's jewelry. Keep things light. Don't try to talk about business strategy or company operations. That stuff is pretty complex and you don't want to embarrass yourself by getting something wrong." I had taken the list and thanked him, watching his face light up with satisfaction at how reasonable and helpful he was being. He genuinely believed he was doing me a favor, protecting me from social missteps by giving me clear guidelines about how to behave around people who actually mattered. That same evening, after Julian had gone to bed, I had called Lauren from my car in the garage where I could speak without being overheard. "It's happening Saturday," I had told her. "I need all the documentation ready." "You're sure about the timing?" Lauren had asked. "Once you do this publicly, there's no taking it back. The media attention alone will be significant." "I'm sure. He's planning some kind of speech where I'm certain he'll make me the punchline. I want to be prepared to respond immediately." Lauren had been quiet for a moment. "I'll have everything ready. Hard copies in a sealed envelope that you can carry with you. The board notification will be prepared to send Monday morning. Are you also moving forward with the CEO transition?" "Yes." "Can you reach out to Elena Morrison? Let her know we may be able to accelerate our previous timeline." "Consider it done." Friday had been surreal. Julian had been in an expansive mood, almost affectionate in a way he had not been in months. He had even asked what I was planning to wear to the dinner, though his question quickly devolved into suggestions about appropriate length and neckline that made clear he viewed my clothing choices as reflecting on him rather than being my own decision. "Something elegant but understated," he had said. "You want to look nice but not like you're trying to compete for attention. This is my night, you know." I had nodded and smiled and let him believe I was grateful for his guidance. Saturday afternoon, Lauren's assistant had delivered the envelope to our house while Julian was out getting a haircut. I had signed for it and immediately hidden it in my handbag, feeling its weight every time I moved. Inside were the legal documents proving my 56% ownership of Pemberton Technologies, along with the formal termination letter for Julian's employment. Everything was prepared with Lauren's characteristic thoroughness. All I had to do was choose the moment to use it. When Julian and I had arrived at the Silverstone Grill that evening, everything had seemed to unfold exactly as I had anticipated. Richard was already holding court at the table with Chelsea and Marcus positioned like loyal courtiers. Connor had arrived moments later, immediately launching into some cryptocurrency monologue that nobody was actually listening to but everyone was politely pretending to find interesting. The evening had followed a predictable rhythm. Appetizers arranged like sculptures on oversized plates, portions so small they seemed designed to mock the concept of actual sustenance. Wine flowing freely, the bottles getting more expensive as the evening progressed. Everyone telling stories about Julian's brilliant sales techniques, his natural charisma, his ability to close deals that others had given up on. Richard had been particularly effusive, telling a story about how Julian had inherited his business instincts, how the Pemberton family had always produced natural leaders. He had gestured expansively while talking, his wine glass sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Nobody had mentioned that the company Richard kept crediting himself with building had nearly collapsed under the weight of his incompetent investment decisions. Nobody had acknowledged that the remarkable turnaround everyone kept celebrating had been funded entirely by capital I had provided. I had sat through it all, asking the bland questions Julian had coached me to ask. I had complimented Chelsea's earrings. I had asked Marcus about his daughter's soccer tournament. I had played my assigned role perfectly, the supportive wife with no opinions or achievements worth discussing. The main course had arrived with appropriate fanfare. Steaks that cost more than most families spent on groceries for a week, cooked to precise specifications by chefs who probably had more formal training than half the executives at our table. Everyone had made exaggerated sounds of appreciation, as if eating expensive meat was itself an accomplishment worthy of praise. That was when Richard had proposed his toast. He had stood, raising his glass with the practiced ease of someone who had given hundreds of similar speeches over his career. To Julian, Richard had announced, top salesperson for the third quarter. A young man who has proven that talent and determination can achieve anything. Someone who makes his father proud every single day. Everyone had raised their glasses. Julian had been glowing with satisfaction, his face flushed not just from wine but from the validation he craved like oxygen. Then Julian had stood to give his response and I had felt everything inside me go very still and very focused. He had started with the standard expressions of gratitude. Thanking his father for opportunities. Thanking his colleagues for their support. His delivery had been smooth and practiced, every pause calculated for maximum effect. Then he had turned to look at me. I also want to thank my wife Violet, he had said, and something in his tone had made me brace for what was coming. She's been incredibly supportive in her own way. She's really mastered all the traditional domestic skills. Keeps the house organized. Manages my schedule. Makes sure my dry cleaning gets picked up on time. There had been polite chuckling from the table. Julian had paused, reading the room, sensing he had an audience that was receptive to where this was heading. I mean, her biggest achievement is probably folding laundry on time, he had continued, and the table had erupted in genuine laughter. She really knows her place. That was when I had understood that there was no going back. This was not affectionate teasing between spouses. This was public humiliation performed deliberately for an audience, designed to establish hierarchy and make clear who held value and who existed merely to support those who mattered. Julian had kept going, warming to his theme, adding the line about me marrying him for money. The laughter had grown louder. Richard had slapped the table. Chelsea had covered her mouth. Marcus had actual tears streaming down his face. And I had reached into my handbag and pulled out the envelope that would end my husband's career. The paper felt heavier than it should have, weighted with more than just the legal documents inside. I slid it across the white tablecloth, watching it move through the candlelight, leaving a trail through the evening that felt irreversible even before Julian touched it. "What's this?" he asked. His tone was still attempting lightness, still trying to maintain the casual confidence he had been projecting all evening. But I could see uncertainty creeping into his expression, the first shadow of recognition that something had shifted in a way he did not understand. "Open it," I said simply. His fingers fumbled with the envelope flap. The whole table had gone quiet now, everyone sensing that the dynamic had changed even if they could not yet articulate how. I watched Julian pull out the documents, watched his eyes begin scanning the first page. The law firm letterhead was visible even from where I sat. Lauren had chosen premium stock paper specifically because it conveyed seriousness, because it made clear that what followed was not casual correspondence but legal documentation prepared with careful attention. I could pinpoint the exact moment Julian understood what he was reading. His face drained of color so completely that for a second I thought he might actually faint. His hands holding the papers began trembling in a way that made the documents shake visibly. His mouth opened but no sound emerged, just a silent attempt at speech that failed to produce any words. I let the silence stretch. Let everyone at the table lean forward, trying to understand what could possibly be written on those pages that would create such a dramatic reaction. Let the tension build until it felt almost unbearable. Then I spoke, pitching my voice to carry clearly across our table and to the neighboring diners who had stopped pretending not to listen. I own 56% of Pemberton Technologies, which means I own this company. Your company. Your father's company. And effective immediately, Julian Pemberton, you're fired. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It felt physical, like the air itself had solidified. Every face at the table froze mid-expression. Richard's wine glass hung suspended halfway to his mouth. Chelsea's hand was still covering her lips from laughing at Julian's previous joke, but now her eyes were wide with shock. Marcus looked like someone had just explained that the fundamental laws of mathematics no longer applied. Connor's mouth hung open in an expression of such complete incomprehension that it would have been funny under different circumstances. But it was Julian's face that held my attention. I watched 18 months of casual dismissal collapse in real time. Every condescending comment, every joke at my expense, every moment he had treated me as decorative furniture incapable of meaningful achievement, all of it was being recontextualized in the space of seconds. I could see him trying to process the information, trying to reconcile the wife he thought he knew with the reality I had just revealed. Richard recovered first, his survival instincts kicking in faster than his son's. He lunged across the table and snatched the documents from Julian's unresisting hands, his movements sharp and desperate. He scanned through the pages rapidly, his face transitioning from confusion to recognition to horror as he saw Lauren's signature, her firm's letterhead, the detailed legal language that left no room for misinterpretation. "This is impossible," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. He kept flipping through pages as if hoping the text might change if he read it from a different angle. "Violet, this can't be legitimate. We had an agreement. You were supposed to be a passive investor. You said you weren't interested in operational decisions." "I said I wasn't interested in day-to-day management," I corrected, keeping my tone measured and calm. "I never surrendered decision-making authority over major corporate actions. You signed the shareholder agreement Lauren prepared. You had the opportunity to have your own attorneys review it before signing. You chose not to because you were too desperate to read the terms carefully. But you," Richard started, then seemed to lose track of whatever argument he was trying to construct. His face had gone from its normal ruddy color to something closer to gray. "You can't just fire my son. This is absurd. We'll contest this. We'll call an emergency board meeting." "The board serves at the pleasure of the majority shareholder," I replied. "That would be me. Your emergency meeting will last approximately as long as it takes the board members to recognize which way the wind is blowing and vote to support whatever restructuring I propose." Julian finally found his voice, though it came out cracked and uncertain. "But you told me you were doing consulting work. You said you had some advisory projects. You never mentioned owning a company, let alone this company." "You never asked," I said gently. The gentleness was deliberate, designed to emphasize the point rather than soften it. "In 18 months of marriage, you never once inquired about what I did professionally. You never asked about my background or my career before we met. You never wondered where I came from or what I had accomplished. You simply assumed I had done nothing worth mentioning because that assumption was convenient for how you wanted to see yourself." I turned to Richard. "Do you remember that Tuesday evening in your office? When you came to me sweating and terrified because your catastrophically bad investment decisions had pushed the company to the edge of bankruptcy? When you admitted you had gambled $17 million on trends you didn't understand? Metaverse real estate, NFT authentication systems, cryptocurrency backed by theoretical carbon credits that never actually existed." Richard's face had gone completely pale now. Several people at the table were looking at him with expressions that suggested this was news to them. Apparently Richard had not shared the full details of how close the company had come to collapse or what had actually saved it. I provided the capital that stabilized this company, I continued. Every promotion Julian has received over the past 18 months was built on that foundation. Every deal he closed used resources that would not have existed without my intervention. Every moment of pride in his achievements was constructed on money I earned and strategically invested while you both assumed I spent my days folding laundry and picking up dry cleaning. Julian was staring at me like he had never seen me before. In a way, I supposed he hadn't. He had spent 18 months looking at a projection of his own assumptions rather than actually seeing who I was. "This is because of a joke?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're destroying my career because I made a joke at dinner?" "This has nothing to do with tonight's joke," I said, though that was not entirely true. "This is about the fact that nepotism and mediocrity are poor foundations for sustainable business growth. Your position at Pemberton Technologies exists because you're Richard's son, not because you're the best person for the role. That dynamic has created a culture where advancement depends on relationships rather than competence. That's going to change." Chelsea finally found her voice, though it came out higher and more strained than usual. "You can't just walk into a celebration dinner and start firing people. There are processes. There are protocols." "I'm the majority shareholder," I replied calmly. "I have full authority to terminate employment at any level, including executive leadership. Julian's position is eliminated effective immediately. Someone from Human Resources will contact him Monday morning regarding severance arrangements and benefits transition." I stood up, smoothing my dress and picking up my handbag. I looked around the table at these people who had spent 18 months treating me as invisible, as inconsequential, as someone whose primary value was keeping Julian's life organized. "Thank you for dinner, everyone," I said. "The steak really was exceptional. Truly excellent quality." I walked toward the restaurant exit, my heels clicking on the polished floor. Behind me I could hear the table erupting into chaos. Julian's voice saying something that sounded like my name. Richard shouting about lawyers and board meetings. Chelsea asking if someone should call corporate legal. Marcus making a sound that might have been laughter or might have been something closer to hysteria. The maitre d' appeared at my side with my coat as if he had been anticipating this exact moment. I thanked him and handed him a folded bill because none of what had just happened was his responsibility, and he had maintained professional composure throughout what was probably the most dramatic dinner service of his career. The night air outside hit my face like a physical sensation, cool and clean after the overheated atmosphere of the restaurant. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness, feeling the weight of what I had just done settle over me like a blanket. Through the restaurant windows I could see our table, everyone standing now, gesturing frantically. Julian had his phone out. Richard was still holding the legal documents, flipping through pages as if the text might have changed. Chelsea appeared to be crying. Marcus was talking rapidly to Connor, both of them looking shocked. My phone started buzzing in my handbag. I pulled it out and saw Julian's name on the screen. I declined the call. It rang again immediately. Richard this time. I declined that one too. I walked to my car and drove home through quiet streets, the townhouse lights visible from blocks away because I had forgotten to turn them off before we left. The space felt different as I walked inside. But also somehow more mine than it had been in months. My phone continued buzzing relentlessly. I set it on the kitchen counter and watched the screen light up with incoming calls. Julian. Richard. Unknown number. Julian again. Another unknown number. The voicemail icon appeared, indicating my mailbox was full. I made tea instead of answering, the familiar ritual of boiling water and selecting a cup providing a strange sense of normalcy after what had just happened. When I finally checked the messages, Julian's voice came through first. The anger I had expected was there, but underneath it was something that sounded almost like panic. "You've destroyed everything," he said, his words tumbling out rapidly. "My career, my reputation, my relationship with my father. How could you do this? What kind of wife destroys her husband's life over a joke? This is insane. You need to call me back right now so we can fix this before it gets worse. Violet, I'm serious. Call me back." I deleted the message halfway through. There was nothing to fix. This was not a misunderstanding that could be resolved through conversation. This was the inevitable consequence of 18 months of systematic dismissal that Julian had assumed would never carry a price. The second message was from Richard, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "We need to talk immediately. What you did tonight was completely inappropriate and potentially illegal. I've already contacted our attorneys. You may own shares in the company, but that doesn't give you the right to terminate my son's employment without proper process. Call me back tonight or my lawyers will be in touch Monday morning. I deleted that one too. Richard could contact as many lawyers as he wanted. Lauren had structured the acquisition with exactly this scenario in mind. Everything was documented, everything was legal, and everything would hold up to any scrutiny Richard's attorneys could provide. The remaining messages followed similar patterns. Chelsea asking if we could talk about what had happened and find some way to resolve the situation. Connor wondering nervously if the restructuring would affect other positions in the sales department. An unknown number that turned out to be a journalist from a business publication asking if I would be willing to comment on the ownership revelation. I turned my phone to silent and sat in the living room with my tea, letting the quiet settle around me. The townhouse felt different in ways I was still processing. Julian's presence had filled this space for so long that his absence created a kind of vacuum. But it was not an uncomfortable vacuum. It was more like the feeling after you remove a weight you have been carrying so long you had forgotten it was there. Sleep came surprisingly easily that night. I had expected to lie awake replaying the evening, questioning whether I had handled things correctly, worrying about what would come next. Instead, I fell into deep dreamless sleep and woke Sunday morning feeling more rested than I had in months. The photographers on the sidewalk outside were an unwelcome surprise. I saw them through the front window while making coffee, 3 men with professional cameras positioned across the street like they were staking out a crime scene. One of them noticed movement through the window and raised his camera. I stepped back quickly, closing the curtains. My phone showed 83 missed calls and hundreds of text messages. I scrolled through them while drinking my coffee, watching the story unfold in real time through the messages people were sending. Someone at the restaurant had apparently posted about what happened on social media. The story had been picked up by business blogs overnight. By morning, articles were appearing on legitimate news sites with headlines that made the situation sound more dramatic than it had felt while I was living through it. Silent majority shareholder revealed in dramatic dinner confrontation, read one headline. How one woman secretly owned her husband's company, proclaimed another. The articles contained varying levels of accuracy. Some had clearly been written by journalists who understood corporate structure and had done their research. Others were essentially gossip pieces speculating about my motivations and relationship with Julian. The comments sections were predictably divided. Some people praised what they saw as a brilliant long-term strategy, calling me a genius who had outmaneuvered everyone around me. Others suggested I was vindictive, that I had destroyed my husband's career over hurt feelings and a bad joke. Several commenters debated whether my actions constituted justified response to mistreatment or represented corporate overreach motivated by personal revenge. I read through dozens of comments before closing my laptop. Public opinion was irrelevant. What mattered was that the legal documentation was unassailable. Lauren had built an ownership structure that would withstand any challenge. The board would support whatever restructuring I proposed because they answered to the majority shareholder. And the majority shareholder was me. Lauren called around 10 in the morning. I assume you've seen the news coverage, she said without preamble. Hard to miss it when there are photographers camped outside my house. Yes, about that. I'd recommend not engaging with any media until we've had a chance to prepare an official statement. My office has been fielding calls since 6 this morning from journalists who want your comment on the situation. What are you telling them? That you're not available for comment at this time and that any questions about corporate structure should be directed to the company's board of directors. Standard deflection until we decide on a communication strategy. I could hear papers rustling on her end of the call. Lauren was always working, always 3 steps ahead of whatever situation she was managing. Richard's attorneys have been calling as well, she continued. They want to discuss the ownership structure and Julian's termination. I've told them I'm happy to provide copies of all relevant documentation but that there's nothing to negotiate. The shareholder agreement is clear and legally binding. What's their angle? They're fishing for anything they can use. Suggesting the agreement was signed under duress. that Richard didn't have adequate legal representation when he signed, that the ownership structure might constitute fraud. None of it has any merit, but they're going to push because that's what lawyers do when their client is desperate. And the board meeting? I asked. Richard called an emergency session for this afternoon. I'll be representing your interests. The vote is essentially predetermined by ownership percentage, but we need to go through the formal process. I expect the board will vote to support your proposed restructuring, including Elena's appointment as CEO and Julian's termination. The meeting took place at 3 o'clock. I stayed home watching the photographers on my sidewalk through the gap in my curtains while Lauren attended the session at Pemberton Technologies headquarters. She called me at 3:12. "It's done," she said. The vote was 7-2 in favor of supporting the restructuring. Julian's termination is official. Elena starts Monday morning as the new CEO. Who voted against? Harold Matthews and David Chin. Both longtime associates of Richard who were probably hoping their loyalty would be remembered when this settles. 2 others abstained rather than vote directly against Richard, which tells you everything about how seriously they take his leadership. I thanked Lauren and ended the call. Through my window I could see one of the photographers checking his phone, probably receiving a notification about the board vote. Within minutes, all 3 of them were making calls, likely to their editors or to other journalists who were covering the story. My phone rang. Julian again. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again. Richard this time. Voicemail. The doorbell rang, making me jump. I looked through the peephole and saw Chelsea standing on my front step, looking nervous and uncomfortable. She was wearing jeans and a sweater instead of her usual business attire, suggesting she had come here on her own rather than in any official capacity. I considered not answering, but curiosity won out over caution. I opened the door but did not invite her inside. "Violet," she said, her voice tentative. "I know you probably don't want to see anyone from the company right now, but I wanted to talk to you. Not as an HR representative. Just as someone who has worked with you and Julian for the past year and a half." "What do you want, Chelsea?" She looked past me into the townhouse, then back at my face. "Can I come in? Just for a few minutes. I'm not here to change your mind or convince you to reverse any decisions. I just think there are some things you should know about what's happening at the company." I stepped aside and let her enter, leading her to the living room but remaining standing rather than sitting down. Chelsea perched on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped together in her lap. "Julian is a complete mess," she said. "He's been calling everyone from the dinner trying to understand how this happened, asking if we knew anything about your ownership. Richard is threatening to sue, though his own attorneys are apparently telling him he doesn't have grounds. The entire executive team is in chaos because nobody knows what to expect when Elena starts tomorrow." "That's why I hired Elena," I replied. "To bring order to chaos that Richard created through incompetence and nepotism." Chelsea nodded slowly. "I'm not defending what Julian said at dinner. That was cruel and inappropriate. But I think you should know that he genuinely had no idea about any of this. The ownership structure, the rescue capital, any of it. He thought you were just his wife who stayed home and managed the household." "I know he didn't know," I said. "That was the point." "I know he didn't know," I said. "That was the point." Chelsea looked at me for a long moment, her expression shifting from sympathy to something closer to understanding. "You were testing him. All of us, really. Waiting to see if anyone would look beyond the surface and actually see you as a person instead of just Julian's wife." "I wasn't testing anyone," I replied, though the truth was more complicated than that. "I was protecting an investment and waiting for the right moment to make necessary changes. What happened at the dinner simply accelerated a timeline I had already established." Chelsea nodded slowly, then stood to leave. "For what it's worth, I think a lot of people at the company are relieved. Richard's leadership style was problematic. And the nepotism was obvious to everyone, even if nobody felt comfortable saying it out loud." After she left, I locked the door and returned to my laptop where I had been monitoring the company remotely through access Lauren had arranged. Monday morning was hours away, and Elena Morrison would be walking into Pemberton Technologies as the new CEO, carrying with her 20 years of experience turning around failing organizations. I had not met Elena in person until 3 months ago, though I had been studying her career for much longer. She had a reputation in the technology sector as someone who could identify systemic problems quickly and implement solutions without getting caught up in office politics or personal relationships. Her last position had been turning around a software company that had been hemorrhaging talent and revenue due to toxic leadership. Within 18 months she had completely restructured the organization, and the company had gone from considering bankruptcy to posting their most profitable quarter in a decade. When I had first approached her about the CEO position at Pemberton Technologies, she had been characteristically direct. "I don't do figurehead roles," she had told me over lunch at a restaurant far from any business districts where we might be recognized. "If I take this position, I need complete operational authority. I'll listen to board input and keep you informed as the majority shareholder, but I won't be micromanaged or second-guessed on strategic decisions." "That's exactly what I want," I had replied. "I have no interest in running the company day to day. I want someone who can fix what's broken and build something sustainable." Monday morning arrived with a sense of inevitability. I woke early and made coffee while watching the sun rise over the city. My phone showed new messages from Julian, but I did not read them. Whatever he wanted to say could wait, or more likely, did not need to be said at all. At 9 o'clock, I logged into the video conference system that would allow me to observe Elena's first meeting with the Pemberton Technologies staff. Lauren had arranged the access through the company's IT department, setting up a passive feed that would let me watch without being visible to anyone else. Elena walked into the main conference room exactly on time, dressed in a sharp navy suit that projected authority without ostentation. The room was packed with employees who had been told only that there would be an important announcement from new leadership. I could see the confusion on many faces, the whispered conversations as people tried to understand what was happening. Elena did not waste time with pleasantries or gentle introductions. She stood at the front of the room and waited for silence, her presence commanding attention without requiring her to ask for it. "My name is Elena Morrison, and as of this morning I'm the CEO of Pemberton Technologies," she began, her voice clear and measured. "I understand that the events of this past weekend have created uncertainty and confusion. Let me provide some clarity. The company has undergone a change in operational leadership. Richard Pemberton has stepped down from his position as CEO, and I have been appointed to lead the organization moving forward." I watched faces in the crowd react to this information. Some people looked relieved. Others appeared worried. A few seemed genuinely shocked that Richard was actually gone. "Over the next several weeks, we will be conducting comprehensive performance reviews across all departments," Elena continued. "These reviews will focus on identifying inefficiencies, redundancies, and opportunities for improvement. Some positions will be restructured. Some roles will be eliminated. These changes are necessary to build a more sustainable and competitive organization." She paused, making eye contact with different sections of the room. "I want to be clear about something. Moving forward, advancement in this company will be based on measurable performance and demonstrated competence. Relationships and tenure will no longer be sufficient qualifications for promotion or position security. If you're good at your job and contribute to the organization's success, you will be recognized and rewarded. If you're coasting on connections or past reputation, you should start updating your resume." The room was completely silent. I watched people processing this information, understanding that the culture they had become accustomed to was about to change fundamentally. Elena spent the rest of the morning meeting with department heads individually. By noon she had scheduled performance audits for every division. By end of business Monday, 3 senior executives had been called into closed-door meetings that resulted in generous severance packages and immediate departure from the building. I watched it all unfold from my home office, deliberately staying away from the physical building because I wanted Elena to establish her authority without any suggestion that I was directing her decisions. The company needed to see her as the CEO with full operational control, not as my representative implementing orders from an invisible owner. Tuesday brought more changes. Elena identified 2 vice presidents whose positions existed primarily to justify inflated titles for people Richard wanted to reward politically. Both were offered attractive severance terms and chose to leave rather than face the alternative of demotion to roles that matched their actual contribution levels. By Wednesday, the gossip networks that existed in every organization were buzzing with speculation about who would be next. I knew this from Lauren, who was receiving regular reports from contacts she maintained within the company. Some employees were panicking, worried that any connection to Richard or Julian would mark them for termination. Others were energized by the changes, seeing opportunity in the restructuring that would reward competence over connections. Thursday afternoon, my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw Julian standing on my front step looking exhausted and defeated. He was wearing jeans and an old college sweatshirt, clothes I had not seen him wear in years because they did not project the successful executive image he normally cultivated. I opened the door but did not step aside to let him enter. "I'm not here to argue," he said before I could speak. "I just need to understand something. Did you plan all of this from the beginning? Was our entire marriage just part of some long-term strategy to take over the company?" "No," I replied honestly. "When we got married, I thought we had a real partnership. The strategy came later, after I realized that you and your father would never see me as anything more than decorative furniture whose primary value was staying quiet and supportive." He flinched at that but did not argue. "I've been going through everything in my head. All the times I dismissed what you were doing, all the jokes I made at your expense. I thought I was being charming. I thought everyone understood it was just playful teasing between spouses." "It wasn't playful," I said. "It was systematic dismissal disguised as affection. And it wasn't just you. Your father set the tone and you followed it. Everyone at that company learned to treat me as invisible because that's what you and Richard modeled." Julian was quiet for a long moment. "The divorce papers arrived this morning. My attorney looked them over and said the settlement is extremely fair. More than fair, actually. He said you're being generous." "I'm being practical," I corrected. "Drawn-out litigation would damage the company and waste resources. This way is cleaner for everyone." "I don't deserve your generosity," he said quietly. "Probably not," I agreed. "But that's not really the point. I'm not interested in destroying you financially. I just needed you out of a position you weren't qualified for and out of a marriage that had become unbearable." He nodded and turned to leave, then stopped and looked back. "For what it's worth, Elena is doing a good job. The company feels different already. More professional. Less like a family business where incompetence gets rewarded because of last names." After he left, I returned to my laptop and continued monitoring the transformation Elena was orchestrating. By Friday, the changes were becoming visible in measurable ways. Employee satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvement. Productivity metrics were trending upward. Client retention remained stable despite the leadership upheaval, largely because Elena had spent her first week personally calling major accounts to assure them of continued service quality and introduce herself as someone with actual credentials rather than just family connections. Friday evening, I received a call from one of the board members who had voted to support my restructuring. "I wanted to thank you personally," he said. "What you did took courage. Richard's leadership had been problematic for years, but nobody felt empowered to challenge him because of his founder status and his relationships on the board. You gave us permission to do what should have been done a long time ago." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet townhouse and realized that something fundamental had shifted. The space no longer felt like Julian's home that I happened to occupy. It felt like mine. 3 weeks passed with surprising speed. The media attention gradually faded as newer scandals captured public interest. The photographers stopped camping on my sidewalk. My phone stopped buzzing constantly with calls from journalists and unknown numbers. Life settled into a new rhythm that felt both strange and comfortable. I spent my days monitoring Pemberton Technologies remotely, watching Elena implement changes that were transforming the company's culture and performance. I met with Lauren twice to discuss the divorce proceedings, which were moving forward with minimal conflict now that Julian had accepted the inevitable. I even started exploring what I might want to do next professionally, now that I was no longer bound to the pretense of being just a supportive wife managing a household. Thursday afternoon arrived with overcast skies that threatened rain. I was working at my desk in the home office, reviewing financial reports that Elena had sent for my review as majority shareholder, when the doorbell rang. Not a polite single chime, but insistent repeated ringing that suggested whoever was outside had no intention of leaving until I answered. I looked through the peephole and felt my stomach tighten. Richard Pemberton stood on my front step, his posture rigid with barely restrained fury. His usually immaculate appearance had deteriorated noticeably. His hair, normally styled with precision, looked disheveled. The lines around his eyes and mouth had deepened, making him appear years older than he had at the dinner 3 weeks ago. I considered not answering. We had nothing to discuss that could not be handled through attorneys and official channels. But I knew Richard well enough to recognize that if I did not face him now, he would simply return repeatedly until I did. Better to deal with this confrontation on my terms. I opened the door but did not step aside to invite him in. Instead, I stepped out onto the front step and closed the door firmly behind me. If we were going to have this conversation, it would happen in public view where Richard would be forced to maintain at least minimal civility. "We need to talk," Richard said without preamble. His voice carried that authoritative tone he used in board meetings, the one designed to make people comply with his demands through sheer force of projected confidence. "About the company. About your plans. About how we're going to resolve this situation." "We can talk," I replied evenly. "But I'm not going to discuss anything that should properly go through Lauren or be handled in official board channels. If you have legal concerns, your attorneys can speak with mine." Richard's jaw tightened. "This isn't about lawyers. This is about family. About loyalty. About recognizing that you've made your point and now it's time to find a reasonable path forward." "I'm listening," I said, though I suspected I already knew where this conversation was heading. Richard glanced at the houses on either side of mine, clearly uncomfortable having this discussion where neighbors might overhear. But I did not offer to move inside, and after a moment he seemed to accept that this was the only venue I was going to provide. "When I came to you 18 months ago," he began, his voice lower now, "you agreed to help save the company. I offered you equity. You accepted. That was supposed to be the end of it. You were supposed to be a silent partner, grateful for the opportunity to be included in the family business." "I was never silent," I corrected. "I was strategic about when and how I exercised the authority I negotiated." "There's a difference." "You manipulated the situation," Richard countered. "You took advantage of my desperation to extract terms that were completely disproportionate to your contribution. I provided $17 million when you had exhausted every other option," I replied calmly. "I saved your company from bankruptcy. The terms were exactly proportionate to the value I provided and the risk I assumed. You signed the agreements after having the opportunity to have them reviewed by your own attorneys. The fact that you were too desperate or too arrogant to read them carefully is not my problem." Richard's face flushed with anger, but when he spoke again his tone had shifted to something that sounded almost like confession. "Julian didn't want me to bring you in," he said. "Did you know that? When I told him I was going to approach you about investing, he argued against it. He said it was a mistake to involve you in the company's financial structure, that we should find institutional investors instead." This was information I had not known. I kept my expression neutral, waiting for him to continue. "I overruled him because institutional investors would have demanded transparency and oversight that would have exposed how badly I had mismanaged the company's assets. I needed someone I could control, someone who would stay quiet and grateful. I thought that was you." Richard laughed bitterly. "Julian was right to be concerned. Not for the reasons he stated but because he recognized something I missed. He knew you were more capable than I wanted to acknowledge. He saw the danger of giving you power, even if he couldn't articulate exactly why it was dangerous. I absorbed this information in silence. Julian had recognized my capabilities and argued against involving me in the company, not out of respect for those capabilities but out of fear that I might use them. Richard had dismissed Julian's concerns because he had been too desperate and too convinced of his own superiority to imagine that I might actually leverage the position he was offering me. "That's an interesting bit of history," I said finally. "But it doesn't change anything about the current situation." "It should," Richard insisted. "It explains why this whole thing happened. I made a mistake in judgment. I underestimated you. But that doesn't mean we can't find a way forward that works for everyone." He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket and held it out to me. I did not take it. "I'm offering to buy back 20% of your shares," he said. "At a significant premium over what you paid. You'd make millions in profit and your ownership would be reduced to 36%. Combined with my 23%, that would give me back majority control. The company returns to family leadership, you walk away with substantial returns on your investment, and we all move forward without this awkwardness." I looked at the document in his hand without reaching for it. "You're asking me to voluntarily surrender the authority I hold in exchange for money." I'm offering you a profitable exit from a situation that has become unnecessarily complicated, Richard corrected. You've made your point. Everyone understands now that you're not just Julian's decorative wife. You've proven you're capable and strategic. Now let's resolve this like reasonable businesspeople instead of letting personal feelings drive corporate decisions. No, I said simply. Richard stared at me like I had spoken in a language he did not understand. You're refusing without even looking at the terms? Do you understand how much money I'm offering you? I understand perfectly. And the answer is no. I'm not interested in selling any portion of my ownership stake. And I'm certainly not interested in giving you back majority control so you can return the company to the same dysfunctional culture that nearly destroyed it in the first place. His face darkened with anger that he was no longer trying to hide. You're being unreasonable. You're letting your emotions about Julian's behavior cloud your business judgment. This is exactly what I was afraid of when he suggested involving you. Women always let personal feelings interfere with rational decision-making. Something cold settled in my chest as I listened to him. This was how Richard actually saw me, saw all women perhaps. We were fundamentally incapable of rational thought, forever at the mercy of our emotions, unable to separate personal grievances from strategic planning. Do you actually believe, I asked quietly, that I made the decision to take control of Pemberton Technologies based on emotions rather than business logic? Of course that's what happened, Richard said as if it were obvious. You were publicly humiliated at the dinner. Julian made jokes at your expense in front of everyone. You reacted out of hurt pride and desire for revenge. That's understandable on a human level, but it's not a legitimate basis for corporate restructuring. I had been planning the restructuring for months, I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building inside me. Elena Morrison and I began preliminary discussions about the CEO position in June. The divorce papers were drafted in August. The timeline for removing Julian from his position was established weeks before that dinner. The only thing that happened at the Silverstone Grill was that Julian's public humiliation gave me the perfect catalyst to accelerate plans that were already in motion. Richard shook his head dismissively. You're rewriting history to justify emotional decisions. I know you're angry about how Julian treated you. I know you felt dismissed and undervalued. But destroying his career and taking over the company isn't the answer. It's vindictive and short-sighted. I looked at Richard's face and saw something I had never fully recognized before. He genuinely could not comprehend a reality where I had been planning strategically for months while maintaining the appearance of passive contentment. His view of me as intellectually limited and emotionally driven was so fundamental to his worldview that he could not process evidence that directly contradicted it. He had never seen me as a complete human being. In his mind, I had always been a supporting character in the narrative of his and Julian's success. An NPC who existed to serve their needs without having complex motivations or independent capabilities. The idea that I might have been observing, analyzing, and planning while appearing to be exactly what they expected was simply beyond his capacity to imagine. This was not something that could be fixed through conversation or explanation. Richard's inability to see me clearly was not a misunderstanding that could be corrected with the right words. It was fundamental to how he understood the world and his place in it. This conversation is over, I said, turning toward my door. Violet, wait. No. We're done here. If you have legitimate business concerns, your attorneys can communicate with Lauren through proper channels. Do not come to my home again. I stepped inside and closed the door, watching through the peephole as Richard stood on my front step for a long moment before finally walking back to his car. After he left, I stood in the entryway feeling something settle inside me that I had not fully recognized was still unsettled. Richard's visit had provided an unexpected clarity. His complete inability to see me as anything other than an emotional, irrational woman making decisions based on hurt feelings had confirmed what I had suspected for months. There was no path to mutual understanding with people who had so fundamentally mischaracterized who I was. The only path forward was the one I had already chosen, building something new while they adjusted to the reality I had created. The weeks that followed Richard's confrontation brought a rhythm to my life that felt both unfamiliar and surprisingly comfortable. I stopped monitoring the company quite so obsessively, trusting Elena to handle the daily operations and strategic decisions that I had hired her to manage. I began exploring what I actually wanted to do with my time and energy now that I was no longer performing the role of supportive wife or secretly managing a corporate rescue. December arrived with early darkness and cold that made the city feel different, more intimate somehow. 3 months had passed since the dinner at the Silverstone Grill, and the transformation at Pemberton Technologies had exceeded even my optimistic projections. I attended the quarterly results presentation on a Thursday afternoon, sitting in the back of the renovated conference center that Elena had commissioned as part of the company's physical transformation. The space looked nothing like it had under Richard's leadership. Gone were the dark wood panels and the oversized portraits of Richard from various stages of his career. In their place was clean modern design with large windows that let in natural light and collaborative spaces that suggested a company focused on actual work rather than performing hierarchy. Elena stood at the front of the room presenting results to a crowd of employees who looked genuinely engaged rather than performing mandatory enthusiasm. I watched faces in the audience and saw people leaning forward, taking notes, asking substantive questions about the strategic vision she was outlining. This was what a functional organization looked like when competence was rewarded and political maneuvering no longer determined advancement. The numbers Elena presented were remarkable. Profits up 19% compared to the same quarter the previous year. Employee satisfaction surveys showing dramatic improvement across every measured category. Client retention not just stable but actually increasing despite the leadership upheaval that had initially worried me. She had accomplished in 3 months what Richard had failed to achieve in years, creating an environment where talented people wanted to work and where results mattered more than relationships. After the presentation ended, Elena caught my eye and gestured toward the hallway. I followed her to a quiet corner away from the dispersing crowd. "What did you think?" she asked. "I think you've exceeded every expectation I had when I hired you," I replied honestly. The cultural transformation is visible in ways that go beyond the financial results. Elena smiled slightly. It helps when you're empowered to actually make necessary changes instead of navigating around entrenched interests and family politics. Richard called me again yesterday, by the way. 6th time this month. He keeps suggesting that I should reconsider some of the personnel decisions, that perhaps we moved too quickly in restructuring certain departments. What did you tell him? That I appreciate his historical perspective but that operational decisions are within my authority as CEO and I'm comfortable with the direction we've taken. She paused. He's not going to stop trying to regain influence. You understand that, right? He views this as a temporary setback rather than a permanent shift in power structure. I know, I said. But his opinions stopped mattering the moment the board voted to support your appointment. He can send emails and make phone calls, but he can't change the fundamental reality that I control 56% of the company and you have my full support to run it as you see fit. Elena nodded, then shifted topics. I wanted to ask you something. Would you be interested in having lunch sometime? Not about company business. Just as two people who might actually enjoy talking to each other. The invitation surprised me. I had hired Elena for her professional capabilities, not expecting or seeking personal connection. But as I thought about it, I realized that the idea appealed to me in ways I had not anticipated. I'd like that, I said. We met for lunch 2 weeks later at a small restaurant far from the business district where we were unlikely to be recognized or interrupted. Elena ordered wine and suggested we avoid talking about Pemberton Technologies entirely for at least the first hour. Tell me about your previous company, she said after our drinks arrived. Not the sale terms or the financial outcome. Tell me about what you actually built and why it mattered to you. I found myself talking about things I had not discussed with anyone in years. The early days of building the data analytics firm with my co-founder, the problems we had identified and the solutions we had developed, the satisfaction of creating something that actually worked and solved real challenges for clients. Elena listened with genuine interest, asking questions that demonstrated she understood both the technical and strategic aspects of what I was describing. Then she shared her own experiences navigating technology leadership as a woman, the countless times she had been underestimated or dismissed, the strategies she had developed for establishing authority in environments designed to exclude her. We discovered we had both learned similar lessons about power and visibility, about when to assert yourself and when to let others underestimate you until the moment you needed to act. The thing I've learned, Elena said as we were finishing our meal, is that invisibility can be a weapon if you wield it intentionally. But it can also become a prison if you forget that you chose it rather than having it imposed on you. Her words resonated in ways I was still processing days later. I had chosen strategic invisibility as a response to Julian and Richard's dismissal, but at some point the choice had started to feel like a constraint rather than a strategy. Now, with the freedom to be visible or invisible on my own terms, I was discovering that I preferred something in between. Present and engaged but not performing or seeking validation from audiences that did not matter. The divorce was finalized the week before Thanksgiving. Julian signed the papers without contesting any terms, and his attorney sent a brief note through Lauren acknowledging that the settlement was fair and expressing Julian's desire to move forward without additional conflict. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had found a position at a competing firm, performing adequately in a role that required actual competence rather than coasting on family connections and nepotism. I saw him once in early December at a coffee shop near the townhouse. He was sitting by the window with his laptop, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, looking less polished than he had during our marriage but somehow more authentic. I could have left without him seeing me, but something made me approach his table. "Julian," I said quietly. He looked up, surprise crossing his face before settling into something more complicated. "Violet. Hi. I just wanted to say that I hope you're doing well," I said. "I know the past few months have been difficult." He was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "I'm learning a lot about myself. About who I was and who I want to be. The humiliation of being fired by my wife in front of everyone I worked with was probably the most devastating thing that's ever happened to me. But it also forced me to recognize things I had been avoiding about how I treated you and how I understood my own success. I'm glad you're finding perspective," I said, meaning it honestly. "For what it's worth," Julian added, "I think you did the right thing. Not just for yourself but for the company. Elena is doing a better job than my father ever did, and the culture is healthier without the nepotism and politics that defined everything when he was in charge." We talked for a few more minutes before I excused myself. As I walked back to my car, I realized that I no longer felt anger toward Julian. What I felt instead was a kind of detached recognition that he was a person who had made choices that hurt me, and I had made choices in response that changed both our lives irrevocably. Neither of us was the same person we had been at the beginning of our marriage, and perhaps that was the only resolution that mattered. Winter settled over the city with cold that made the air feel sharp and clean. I walked out of the Pemberton Technologies Conference Center after Elena's year-end strategic planning presentation and stood on the sidewalk watching my breath fog in the December afternoon. The company I had saved 18 months ago now functioned like an actual professional organization rather than a family business masquerading as a legitimate enterprise. Richard still owned his 23% and occasionally sent lengthy emails questioning various decisions Elena made, but the board had made clear that his input was noted and promptly disregarded. He was learning to be a minority shareholder with opinions rather than an unchallenged authority, and I suspected that lesson was more painful for him than any financial loss could have been. And I had returned to my preferred state of relative invisibility, though now it was a conscious choice rather than a defensive strategy. Most employees at Pemberton Technologies had no idea I was the majority shareholder. They knew Elena as their CEO and trusted her leadership, which was exactly what I had wanted. I had never needed visibility or recognition. What I had needed was agency and respect, the freedom to build something meaningful without being dismissed or diminished simply because I did not perform my capabilities in ways that demanded constant attention. Standing there in the winter afternoon, I thought about the woman I had been 18 months ago when Richard had come to me desperate and sweating, begging for capital to save his failing company. I had been invisible then too, but it had been an invisibility imposed by people who refused to see me clearly. Now the invisibility was mine to control, to deploy or abandon as circumstances required. I had spent 18 months being treated as furniture, being laughed at for being ordinary, being assumed to have achieved nothing more significant than keeping Julian's household organized. Now I was the architect who had quietly rebuilt what others had nearly destroyed, who had proven that the most dangerous underestimation is assuming that silence means weakness rather than strategy. And honestly, that felt extraordinary. If this story of calculated justice and silent power had you captivated from beginning to end, show your support by hitting that like button right now. My favorite part was when Violet calmly slid that envelope across the dinner table, watching 18 months of dismissal collapse in a single moment. What was your favorite moment? Share it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories of resilience and revenge. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you're notified the instant we upload. 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 The instant we upload.